The Tenement Museum in Lower Manhattan pays tribute to those often invisible citizens of America, immigrant workers who struggled through poverty to make a place for themselves in a new land, one that claimed to welcome outsiders but offered many obstacles along the way. A new exhibit explores the identities of those left out and left behind and why it's relevant today.
So this was an actual tenement.
This building, was a tenement from 1863 to 1935. People lived here.
Just imagine.
Oh, these are narrow.
Stepping back in time.
There was no light in this hallway originally.
Seeing how the other half lived a century and a half ago.
And there are 20 families that live in the building.
People struggling to eke out an existence in cramped quarters with poor ventilation and no indoor plumbing.
Between 1940 and 1960, over 1 million Puerto Ricans coming to New York.
For 35 years, New York's Tenement Museum has tried to preserve the history of the immigrant. Poor, anonymous, newly minted citizens searching for a better life, often serving the needs of Manhattan's rich and famous.
Here we see Joseph P. Moore.
Kat Lloyd is curator.
He's a waiter. He was an Irish immigrant who lived in this building, 97 Orchard Street.
Since its founding, only those who actually lived in this building, like the Irish Joseph Moore, were given the museum treatment until patrons noticed something else.
Visitors looking at this record started to ask about the Joseph Moore listed directly above and ask questions about the racial designation that we see next to his name. People wanted to know, right, what were the experiences of Irish immigrants and Black New Yorkers?
Those questions sparked a new exhibit on that other Joseph Moore, one that Mellon graduate fellow Marquise Taylor was hired to investigate.
So Joseph Moore was an African-American man that was born in Belvedere, New Jersey in 1838, and he decided to come to New York in 1857. And he was a man who worked as a waiter. He also worked as a coachman because work for Black men during that time was seasonal. And he decided to establish a home at 17 Lawrence Street with his wife, Rachel Moore.
But the Moores, who were Catholic too, weren't the only Black people living in tenements in Lower Manhattan back then.
In the process of research, we looked at our own archive, and that's when we found the letter from Gina Manuel.
Gina Manuel wrote that letter as a concerned citizen in 1988, the year the museum opened.
She talked about her family's history, that her family had lived in Lower Manhattan, that they had worked on the South Street Seaport. And so she asked the museum when we were founding it to please include the stories of Black New Yorkers, particularly living in tenement apartments in Lower Manhattan.
3 decades later, there are mementos from Manuel's family.
These are all objects that belong to her great-grandmother, Parthenia Lawrence, who was a Black New Yorker, lived in tenements in the 1860s.
These are tiny little books.
I know.
Items that conjure the personal lives of those who once possessed them.
Maybe most important is this object in the center here, this book of Abraham Lincoln's speeches. And to think about a book of Abraham Lincoln's speeches being read in a tenement home, that's so different than how we tend to learn about the Civil War. We wanted to know what were the conversations among free Black New Yorkers in the 1860s as these changes in the nation were taking place.
It turns out that Gina Manuel's ancestors and the Moores were actually neighbors.
Front building and back building of the same exact address in 1870. And so almost certainly they knew each other, would have seen each other in the courtyard, and that really inspired us to dig into this neighborhood further.
It led them to Moore's long-lost relative.
Nothing ever pinpointed to New York City until I went to the Tenement Museum. And once they showed me all of their research, it kind of like started all clicking.
Ashley Pinkowski had been hitting dead ends while tracing her family tree.
This was not passed down to our family. This is all things that I really had to find out on my own.
She suspects work was the primary motive for the move to the Big Apple. Taylor says clues suggest another motive.
We had discovered a newspaper article that talked about a Black man who had lived in New Jersey, the same community as Joseph Moore. This is at the same time that the fugitive slave law had been in effect, which basically incentivized, right, an entire market of recapturing people and bringing them further back south.
Joseph Moore holds an even deeper connection for Taylor.
I actually went to high school just 2 blocks north of 17 Lawrence Street. When I was in high school, I actually went to the Tenement Museum and I took a tour, and I actually thought that African American history didn't have a place in the Lower Manhattan.
The place the Moores called home has been recreated inside the museum.
An article mentioned that he had a portrait of Abraham Lincoln on his wall. And so we have a portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the mantle.
A 2-room flat that the census shows was occupied by the couple, their daughter, and 2 other people.
An Irish woman named Rose Brown, and then Rose's 14-year-old son, Louis, who is one of the many New Yorkers who has a black father and an Irish immigrant mother. So they probably sleep in the kitchen space, actually, right? They would have mattresses here in the closet that they would pull out at night.
Oftentimes you have in 19th century New York City African Americans and Irish people living alongside one another. Both groups were sort of deemed undesirable to people who were often leasing and renting properties. You have to understand that they are also competing usually for jobs, for housing, so that creates some sort of tension as well.
Tension that by 1863 led to the violence and terror of the Civil War draft riots. 25% of the black population fled Lower Manhattan to other parts of the city.
This article talks about a white proprietor in Lower Manhattan who actually laid off his black staff, right, because of the fear of mob violence during this time.
It's a fuller picture of a time nearly erased by the physical progress of a new century, a history now open to everyone.
And that's what I love about the museum, is that visitors asking questions inspires us, right? We do new research, we create new tours, and that it's this dynamic that keeps things really fresh.
And the museum just brings so much to life, the context of the people living in that era. I tell you, it really gives you a sense of how we all got together and sometimes didn't.
So many stories, and that letter of asking, please don't forget them. I thought that was really...
And I like that they keep learning, too, when visitors ask them questions. It leads them to learn more.
Certainly does.
Yeah, fascinating story. Thank you, Michelle.